So we're going to talk tonight a little bit. So, what is the issues of overfatness? Why do we have to worry about it? When I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about obesity. Obesity is a completely different animal. Obesity, by numeric analysis, is related to BMI indexes and relationship of BMI indexes or relationship of body mass relative to your height stature. Most of the reporting on incidence rates do not report overfatness because a person can be overfat but not be obese. And a person can be obese but not be overfat. When we're talking about overfatness, we're talking about the impact that excess body fat, in particular visceral body fat, has on normal physiological responses. No pun intended, there's a growing population of at risk for developing issues of overfatness. It's been exponentially growing over the last 20 years. This is the latest data coming out of the CDC. They're still issues here within overfatness are cardiovascular diseases, metabolic syndromes, and cancers. Cancers is a very difficult beast to narrow down a specific cause, and so we're going to ignore that. We're going to talk specifically about cardiovascular issues, and we're going to talk specifically about metabolic issues. When you talk about metabolic issues, there's two distinct things that you need to talk about. Most people talk about metabolic issues this way, in terms of diabetic conditions. This is the percent of type 2 diabetes within the population by state. And once again, you can note that there is a continual rise based off of percent of the population that has type 2 diabetes diagnosed. But metabolic syndrome is more than just type 2 diabetes. In fact, type 2 diabetes is the end product of metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome actually starts with this right here, dyslipidemia. Dyslipidemia is having too much lipid within the bloodstream, in particular high levels of cholesterol or high levels of triglyceride. It's the high levels of triglycerides and the high levels of cholesterol that have impacts later on in the metabolism that eventually leads to the diabetic issues. In between diabetes and cardiovascular disease, as you note here, this is the ideal population in terms of percent that we should see. This is what we see within the population as a whole. It's somewhere between a 2.5 to 4-fold increase above the ideal population for cardiovascular disease. Most of the cardiovascular disease and most of the diabetic issues are linked to changes in physical activity more than changes in dietary and nutritional status. The Government Accounting Office in 2011 stated that there's somewhere between $50 and $100 billion spent annually to combat every type of health issue that's been associated with overfatness. What are the health issues that we have to worry about? When we usually talk about issues with obesity or issues with overfatness, we usually throw up this scale here, the calorie in to calorie out scale. Everybody's seen this before, right? Where if you have too much of this and not enough of that, what can happen? You become obese. You don't necessarily become overfat. Because if I want to put on muscle mass, if I want to put on fat-free mass, I still have to have more calories in than I have calories out. The problem with doing with this is that you don't look at it in terms of what is the health aspect of it, or what we talk about as health status. Health status is more related to the issues of fatness and fitness, where fatness is looking at what are the hormones being sent out by fat cells or cells associated with fat cells versus what are the hormone changes as I change my health or fitness behaviors. If I swing towards the fatness scale, I become unhealthy or swing towards a disease. The problem is, it's a complex beast. It's a complex beast because there are multiple cogs all spinning at the same time, trying to eventually get to this output of overall health, where we have familial influences, such as what do I have in terms of family biases towards eating? What do I have in terms of family biases towards meal times? What do I have towards family biases in terms of physical activity? The physical activity thing for a lot of immigrant populations within the United States is a gender-specific issue, which is why we see more metabolic issues occurring in females than in males of immigrant populations. What are the environmental influences? Do I have access to things? Do I have access to parks? Do I have access to exercise areas? Do I have access to gyms? Do I know where the markets are? Or am I going to be stuck eating McDonald's and fast food and not doing anything but that? What are the hormonal influences that are going on? Things like your anabolic hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, IGF, MGF, your inflammatory hormones, TNF-alpha, CRP, IL-6, IL-1, IL-2. What are the genetic influences? What genes are coding for receptors? What genes are coding for hormones? All of these influence the physiological and the sociological factors. The physiological and sociological factors combine to give us our body morphology and our health behaviors. The body morphology and the health behavior appear to be a self-selected behavioral link, meaning if I have some sort of body morphology, I'm going to self-select towards a distinct health behavior. All of this leads to the overall output. And it goes like this. This is the complex web of network leading to the overall change in health status. The principal thing that everybody talks about is that high dietary intake, but the thing is that this high dietary intake only has one link into it, and that one link is that. Whereas activity has multiple links into the cascade of events. This whole cascade of events is based off of what we refer to as the upper regulatory elements of response. The regulatory elements of response is governing how does the body respond to various physiological stimuli. And it starts with these components. These are the upper regulatory elements. We have the exercise stimulus or the activity stimulus. We have the nutrition stimulus. We have the gender and age stimulus. We have the adiposity stimulus, and we have the psychological stimulus. Out of all of those, the ones we cannot do anything about are the gender and age stimulus, because physiological response changes between genders, and it changes as you age. We can do a little bit about the psychological thing, but not too much, because that psychological thing will directly affect the exercise thing. And it has to do with that self-selection or self-appeasement for exercise. A lot of times what happens, and this is one of the things that I was talking with Pam about earlier, there's a lot of research that went in when the Obamas came into office and Michelle Obama did the everybody move or let's get moving. But the problem is that the whole program was about the kids simply getting up and being active. The problem is that a lot of the overfat kids don't like doing the activities that they're being forced to do. And anybody who has a little kid or anybody who remembers being a little kid, if you were forced to do something, you were less likely to do it by yourself. And the problem is that when I do not have a psychological appeasement to the exercise stimulus, I stop doing the exercise stimulus. What that does is that leads to a lower level of physical activity. The lower level of physical activity couples with a poor nutrition and a rise in adiposity, which feeds downwards within all of the various levels of the organism, eventually getting to the cellular responses. In the cellular responses, we have a distinct change in hormone production and hormone response, where we get a reduction in our anabolic hormones, we get a reduction in the receptors for those anabolic hormones, and in the blood, we see more binding proteins, more proteins that hold on to those hormones, so the hormones cannot interact with the cells, than what should be there. All of this leads to an anabolic dysregulation. Overfatness is an anabolic dysregulation disease. Anabolic dysregulation is where we do not have proper response to the anabolic hormones. For guys, this typically leads to a hypogonadal issue. For girls, this typically leads to a PCOS issue, a polycystic ovarian issue, because the gonads stop responding correctly and stop behaving correctly. In terms of the rest of the tissues, we get a reduction in metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility is the ability for your cells to use multiple types of fuel sources in all of their metabolic processes, in particular ATP regeneration. People who have this anabolic dysregulation stop being able to use lipids as their principal fuel source when they're not doing stuff. And so what ends up happening is they start building up lipids within the plasma. It's that buildup within the lipids of the plasma that causes changes here, because the cells, because there's too much lipid in the plasma, stop taking in glucose. And glucose triggers insulin secretion. But the problem is that the cells, because they're not going to be metabolically flexible, do not respond to the insulin correctly. That's why when I said that type 2 diabetes is the end result of metabolic syndrome, that's the reason why it's the end result of metabolic syndrome. Now, we also get cardiovascular issues. We get an increase in endothelial adhesions. Basically, you get atherosclerotic plaques. You get plaques within the arteries that make the arteries stiffer and less compliant. This endothelial adhesion is partially mechanically induced because the person's not active, and partially hormonally induced. And we'll take a look at what that means when we start looking at the synergy of responses. In terms of body composition, we get an increase of visceral fat, we get a reduction in lean body tissue, and we get a change in what's referred to as adipocyte differentiation. There are different types of adipocytes. There are what are referred to as white adipocytes, and they are referred to as brown adipocytes. We have both of them throughout our body. When we start collecting large amounts of visceral fat, all of the adipocytes start behaving like white adipocytes and stop behaving like brown adipocytes. It's those change in adipocytes that end up changing some of the hormones we're going to talk about. The ultimate result here is the diseased health status, and the diseased health status all comes back to this change right here. So, if that's the change that leads the theoretical impact that exercise has. Well, we look at it in terms of a continuum. It's a continuum of disease relative to activity, where if I'm very, very inactive, I have a greater level of risk for disease as opposed to someone who is active and fit. As I progress up and go from being completely inactive to being sedentary, the difference between the sedentary person and the inactive person is the amount of activities of daily living that the person does. The inactive person gets up out of bed, goes sits in front of the couch, eats bonbons all day while watching TV. The sedentary person gets up out of bed, showers, makes breakfast, goes to work, sits in front of the computer all day, goes home, sits in front of the television. That's the difference between the two. This right here leads to an increase in overfatness because of that whole cascade of events that we just went through. However, as I start to increase my activity, I don't automatically go from being here to being out here, regardless of how much activity all of a sudden I do. I have to go through this continuum. There's an overlap in what's referred to as the active overfat, or what some people refer to as the fit fat, or the fat and fit. These are people who have reduced this relative risk, but have not gained the relative decrease. So they still have the propensity for all of the health issues, but they no longer have as much overfatness as they had before. This decrease here appears to occur very acutely to training. So as soon as the person starts to exercise, they start having an immediate shift towards the active overfat, but they stay in this active some time. So if we have this continuum, what's that mean about those upper regulatory? We now have a psychological appeasement to exercise or to activity, particularly if we can match the activity or the exercise that the person likes, which means that you can't say, oh, you're overfat, go run. Oh, you're overfat, go walk. Where if you ever talk to any physicians, that's the general recommendation that the physicians give. Go do something. Problem is that if I don't have that psychological appeasement for doing something, I'm going to stop doing it. So if we can increase the psychological appeasement, we can increase the level of physical activity. Not only can we increase the level of physical activity, but we can differentiate that level of physical activity based on what's referred to as the acute program variables. The acute program variables are things like how many times am I going to do an exercise? How many repetitions am I going to do each time? How much resistance am I going to use? What percent of my heart rate am I going to run at? How long am I going to run? How many days in between exercise am I going to have? How many days per week am I going to exercise? Those are all the acute program variables. That goes into how we design and implement the exercise intervention. Eventually that feeds down into the cellular response, where now we have a reversal of the anabolic dysregulation. We now get anabolic normalization. We now get an increase in our anabolic and androgenic hormones. We now get an increase in the receptors. We now get a decrease in the proteins in the blood that are holding on to those hormones. We get a normalization of leptin and a normalization of insulin. These two hormones here have the greatest impact on downstream or late-term metabolic issues, because leptin and insulin are going to directly impact the energetics and the metabolic flexibility at the various tissues. So we get this anabolic normalization, and what do we get as a result? We get an increase in metabolic flexibilities. So now I can start using all of the different types of fuel sources for all the various types of metabolism that my cells are going to do. I'm now going to have an increase in my sensitivity to leptin and to insulin, which means that the cells are now going to start responding to those hormones, which means that I'm going to have a reduction in my glucose within the plasma, which means that I am now going to start having an increase in my fatty acid utilization. Because I have an increase in my fatty acid utilization, I have a reduction in my fat masses. As I have a reduction in my fat masses, the fat cells themselves start behaving differently. What they start doing is they start going from being a white adipose to a brown adipose. And what they start doing is they start basically burning through, for lack of a better analogy, all of the lipids that they have. They start having rapid amounts of what's called lipolysis. And what they do is they basically start shrinking down the volume of adipose cells that are there. If the adipose cell can get shrunk far enough, the adipose cell itself will end up dying. Because we have a mechanical load going on, because we're increasing physical activity, we get an increase in arterial compliance. That means that the artery itself can expand and contract more easily, which means that if we look at the blood pressure of the person is going to go down. Their heart rate is going to change. Their cardiovascular functions are going to change. Their cardiorespiratory measures, their aerobic fitness is going to improve. We get a reduction in inflammatory responses. In particular, we're no longer in a chronic inflammatory state, which means that we can now behave normally. If we happen to have an infection or we happen to have a disease that we can come in contact with, we can normally take care of it without any problem. The problem with a person who's overfat is that they already have a high level of inflammatory signals. So anytime they have any type of injury, anytime they have any type of illness, it goes overboard. So if we can handle that, then we can actually have normalized response to any type of stress that's placed on the body. And eventually, we can get to a non-diseased state. And that's an eventual thing. Regardless of what all of the mass market people will try to tell you. How does it happen? We go back to the big, huge cascade of events here. On this one here, calories have an impact. And it has an impact in particular on growth hormone. where if you can have a highly restrictive caloric diet, and we're talking 800 kcal per day or less, growth hormone goes up. And it's all types of growth hormone. Okay, time out. Growth hormone is not one hormone. There's a whole cascade of hormones that we call growth hormone. And different types of growth hormone have different types of stimuli. When you have a high caloric restriction, you stimulate the growth hormone that increases this lipolysis.
Irrespective of age or gender?
Irrespective of age or gender. In fact, that's where one of the issues that has come about in terms of following a caloric restricted diet throughout your life has been linked to, in terms of correlation, a prolonged lifespan. However, the mechanisms for doing that is not really well understood. We know that at least in rat models, if we can put the rat on a very, very, very low caloric intake, they're living 2 to 3 times longer in captivity than what they would normally live. Problem is that we haven't done studies in humans to validate the rat models.
Doesn't their quality of life go down as well?
No, the quality of life does not. The quality of life does not go down. In fact, the quality of life, in terms of the decline of quality of life, plateaus out as they get older. However, as they get very, very old, it drops very, very quickly. Now, if you notice, there's a question mark here on one of the lines coming away. And the question mark here is because of the different responses that we see within the response to exercise. Endurance exercise and resistive exercise have different effects cellularly and hormonally. When we talk about endurance exercise, most people use the term aerobic. However, it's a misnomer because you can do things that are quote unquote not aerobic and still have it be endurance. And I'll show you the stats when we look at the difference between what's low-level stim resistance training versus endurance training. Endurance training is any type of exercise that is done for a prolonged period of time at a set level of intensity. So if you pick up a 15-pound weight and lunge 200 yards back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, that's an endurance exercise because you haven't changed any of the outward level of intensity. Whereas resistance exercise is something where you have a variable level of intensity for a variable level of duration. Now, if you notice, if we increase resistance exercise, we do not have a question mark. And it has to do with this type of cascade that's heading out. When we have the endurance training stimulus, we have a stimulus coming away from the muscle contractions that has a slight change in our anabolic hormones. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't change an enzyme. And that enzyme is right here, aromatase. Aromatase is an enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogen. It's naturally occurring. The problem with people who are over fat is they have high levels of aromatase. The problem when you do endurance training is it does not affect that aromatase. And it doesn't affect the aromatase because of the training stimulus that endurance training has. What endurance training can do, besides just this muscle contraction, is it kicks up a metabolite. The metabolite it kicks up is an enzyme known as AMPK, adenosine monophosphate kinase. Adenosine monophosphate kinase is a signal to the cells that, hey, we're doing stuff for really, really long periods of time. We don't want to get big, because if I get too big, I can't do stuff for really long periods of time. And so in order to combat that, we do not have any impact on the aromatase. There's a difference when we look at what happens with the resistance training stimulus. We still have that same stimulus heading out to the muscle contraction. However, we now have a block on the aromatase, which now allows testosterone to stay as testosterone. In fact, we get a slight elevation in testosterone following resistance training, both acutely and chronically. What this does is this increases lean body mass. It increases not only the amount that's there, but it increases the size that's there. The other thing that resistance training can do, if patterned correctly, is block the cortisol so that we do not have the inhibitory effect that cortisol has on the building of the lean body tissues. Cortisol is a good hormone, but in abundance, it's a bad hormone because what it does is it likes to catabolize, likes to break down collagen fibers in particular for utilization of proteins in energetic stuff. And so if we cannot block that cortisol, we do not get this hypertrophication signal. Endurance training has very little impact on cortisol, whereas resistance training, if once again you can pattern it correctly, we can block that cortisol response. The end result, whether we're looking at resistance training or endurance training, which is gone now, is this change here, where we end up having an increase in adipocyte apoptosis, where the cells are dying, where we get an increase in angiogenic signals, and then at the cells themselves, we get an increase of glucose uptake. We also get a change in what type of fuel sources we're using, and the change in the type of fuel sources we're using is linked directly to a change in the functions of the mitochondria. One of the issues with aging that happens more often than not is a loss of either mitochondrial enzymes or the mitochondria themselves. It's a naturally occurring thing that happens. It's one of the reasons why old people feel cold all the time. It's also one reason why old people cannot do activities for prolonged periods of time. Whether you do resistance training or endurance training, you can increase both the enzymes within the mitochondria as well as the amount of mitochondria within the tissues themselves, which means that the tissues become more aerobically fit, if you want to use that term, for doing energetics, which means that the cells themselves and the tissues themselves, in particular skeletal muscle, can do activities for longer periods of time. And once again, it doesn't matter whether we're doing resistance training or endurance training. They happen simultaneously. That's the theoretical. Now let's actually take a look at what happens in between the exercise. People who throw around the word exercise really don't know what it means. So let's talk about some terms. We've already used a few of them so that everybody's on board with what those terms actually mean. The first terms we have to worry about is physical activity versus exercise. Physical activity is doing anything, whereas exercise is a regimented doing anything. There's a pattern that's repeatable for exercise that is not there for physical activity, which is why if you look at recommendations coming out from ACSM or from AMA or from ADA, the American Medical Association, American College of Sports Medicine, or the American Diabetic Association, all the recommendations are this. They're physical activity recommendations. They're not this, exercise recommendations. In fact, most of them are do 150 minutes per week at some quote-unquote moderate level of intensity, with no definition of what moderate level of intensity happens to be. That's physical activity. Within exercise, there's three distinct ways of looking at exercise. We have resistance exercise. Resistance exercise does not necessarily mean lifting weights. It's doing short duration, interval, repeated exertions. Whereas when we're talking about endurance exercise, this is long duration exercise. For resistance exercise and for endurance exercise, if you do it for multiple days, it now becomes what's called training. Training is not a single event, it's a multiple event. In fact, it's not just a multiple event, it's a repeated multiple event. If you put resistance exercise and endurance exercise together, you're now doing what's referred to as concurrent training. There are a whole host of ways of doing concurrent training. The classical way of doing concurrent training is to have an endurance event followed by a resistance event, or doing a resistance event followed by an endurance event. There are other ways in which you do what's referred to as a circuit interval training, where you do some resistance with some endurance followed by some resistance followed by some endurance within a set pattern of exercise. And then you can have concurrent training where one day a week you do resistance training, where another day a week you do endurance training, and you basically oscillate between those. Whenever you talk about types of training, you have to always focus on this right here, level of stimulation, which a couple friends have jokingly called the Comstock-Clark rule, which means that when you talk about level of stimulation, you can't say, oh, it's just about training volume. It's about how much muscle you actually recruited. In this case, people who are over fat automatically have a higher level of stimulation, even at a lower absolute level, because the person who is over fat has additional load that's not muscle that they have to move. The other thing that we talk about in terms of this level of stimulation is how much rest do I have, not only within the exercise bout, but between exercise bouts. All of that patterns into how we actually have endurance exercise, resistance exercise, or concurrent training. When you take all of those together and you put it into a prolonged bout, it becomes what should be referred to as periodization. The body does a thing. It's called the SAID principle. SAID is an acronym. Specific adaptations to impose demands. Simply put, the body's going to do what you tell the body to do. Which means that if all I ask the body to do is 15-pound weights every day, all the body's going to respond to do is doing 15-pound weights every day. When you do and set up endurance, resistive, or concurrent training, you do it where you modulate the level of training intensity. And you modulate the level of training intensity so that the body is undergoing constant adaptations. It doesn't have a chance to adapt to a single imposed demand. There's multiple imposed demands. The problem with that, we talk about exercise. Current reports from the CDC reports that about 40% or less of adults 18 to 65 meet that recommendation of activity per week. Of those 40%, 80% attempt multiple bouts of hypocaloric conditions, either diet, exercise, or diet and exercise. Most of them do it 4 to 5 times in a calendar year. And they typically stop doing it because of either unrealistic goals or not understanding how long distinct adaptations take. Which leads us to the next problem, compliance and attrition rates. Compliance is willing to do what you're being told to do. Attrition is following through for a prolonged period of time. Within a 12-month period, less than 15% of all adults who have started a program stay in the program. Within 6 months, it's 50%. Within 2 months, it's 60%. Perpetuation of some issues. The other issue here is what we do in terms of looking at what's out there. And what a friend of mine has told me is an overexposure to the quote-unquote renowned fitness expert. And I actually did a search yesterday online, and that's just a smattering of what goes on. In fact, most of these renowned fitness experts are somehow pitching some mass market product. And most of the mass market products are conflating that issue of periodization into a program that's complex for complexity's sake. It's not complex in order to cause continual adaptation. It's complex because I'm doing this that someone else isn't doing. It has nothing to do with whether it's beneficial or not. It's all about, can I make a market for myself? When that takes into place, we have to worry about issues with the person who is overfat by themselves, because those two things affect everybody. For the person who is overfat, there's 2 distinct factors which will limit what type of exercises they are recommended to do. That is the social stigma bias and the application bias. The social stigma bias is that, fat people should only do this, or overfat people should only do that, or women should only do this, or men should only do that. And then you go and talk to the health experts, the physicians, the nurses, the nurse assistants, the physician's assistants, the nurse practitioners, the physical therapists, most of them who maybe had an exercise physiology class in their undergraduate days, but haven't had an exercise physiology class in decades. They follow what we like to talk about as being application bias, which is, ACSM says you should do this, so that's what I'm going to tell you to do. Or this is what I found to be most beneficial, so I'm going to have you do that. And what happens is that it pigeonholes what the person who's overfat can or cannot be doing. Which goes back into the, in my humble opinion, type of issues, which is where I did this, and if you go on Yahoo today and just punch in health, you'll get 5 million response. I did it last night, and it was 5,155,000 responses of, this is what happened to me. You should do this because this worked for me. Responses. People are constantly bombarded with that. The problem is that they don't understand what's the underlying principle of why it might have worked for them, but why it might not work for you. And it has to do with the fact that when they're talking about stuff, they're talking about things based on absolutes. But the problem is that every study or every intervention program, the program variables are so dissimilar that absolute values don't tell us anything. Because they did something for 6 months versus somebody doing something for 1 month. Duration has a large impact. Level of intensity has a large impact. Because we have all of these issues here, we have an impact on what ACSM has liked to term exercise as medicine. The problem if we're going to use exercise as medicine is that we have to have a dose response. If we don't have a dose response, we cannot use exercise as medicine. The reason why you go to the doctor and the doctor says take this one tablet every 6 hours is because they know what the dose response is going to be based on all of your underlying physiology. So we have all of those issues. We have all of those problems. So what do the findings tell us?
Thanks for listening. Please make sure to subscribe so you'll be able to get future recordings and future presentations on related topics.